is the effort towards improving the Ethereum blockchain by providing the best standards for the community to be following. If you are interested in deep diving to learn the secrets of EIP editing, continue watching. Welcome back to another episode of PEEPanEIP, an educational video series where we learn about an Ethereum improvement proposal, upcoming upgrades, and the basics of Ethereum blockchain. This is the 55th episode, and the guest on the show is the one who also happened to be the first guest of this amazing show, Matt Garnett. It's nice to have you, Matt.
Thanks, Pooja.
As many of you may already know, Matt is heavily engaged with the development work of the execution layer client, worked with major EIPs such as EIP 1559, EIP 2938, the account abstraction, EIP 3074, and currently championing the proposal EIP 44. He is an experienced editor and currently mentoring the EIP apprenticeship program. In this episode, we are going to learn about the secrets of EIP editing. So without further ado, over to you, Matt.
Thanks a lot, Pooja. Yeah, it's pretty cool that I was the first guest on the PEEPanEIP series, and it's been awesome seeing lots of other really great guests and really great sessions. Yeah, so I guess I'll just jump into it. The title of this talk, I guess, is The Secrets of EIP Editing. I ended up making the title of mine Intro to EIP Editing because I don't feel like there's that many secrets to it. It kind of sounds like it's a little bit of like an insider club with secrets. And so I think it's a pretty open type of pretty open project. And I think that everything that we do is available for people to see who want to follow. And it's more a matter of trying to consolidate a lot of that information into a single place. But yeah, let's get into the secrets that we have out there. So the first thing I think is important is to talk about what an EIP editor even is, because it's just this term that people refer to myself and a couple other people as, and I don't think a lot of people actually understand what EIP editors do. So I think of EIP editors as basically the custodians of the standards repository of Ethereum. And so there's this EIPs repository, and this is where we try and put all of the standards that either go into the Ethereum protocol or manage the application layer interfaces between smart contracts and other different types of EIPs. But the editor is really the people who are trying to curate a consistent, solid set of EIPs that are readable, that anybody from around the world can access and contribute to. So the current active EIP editors are these three profiles. It's Alex, myself, and Micah. And there's a lot of old EIP editors who used to be active at one point or another, and have kind of like not been active for the last few months or years. And I think that that's something that's important to note, is that this isn't like something you just sign up for life. You don't have to be an EIP editor and then feel like you can't step down at any point. It's if you have time to contribute and help the Ethereum standards repository, then your time is like very welcome and your contributions will be welcome. But it's it's a cool thing to be a part of. And then whenever you run out of time, then it's totally okay to just step down and move on and contribute to other places in the Ethereum stack. So let's talk a little bit about the high level responsibilities that editors tend to have. And I think that the most important thing that we do is that we ensure that all of the requirements of EIP 1 are met. EIP 1 is kind of the canonical source of all of the information about how the EIP repository is governed, what EIPs should and should not have. And so it's important that we, as editors, enforce all of those requirements. And we'll talk about it in a little bit. There are some automated checks that help us avoid simple things, simple errors that happen frequently, but it's still at the end of the day, the editor's job to ensure that, everything that needs to be done in EIP is done. And so one of these things that's not automated too much is it's checking for spelling and grammar errors. We do have a spell checker, so that is that's done in the continuous integration suite, but checking for grammar, reading for clarity, this is an important role of the editor. And this is very much like, in the most traditional sense, like what is an editor of some sort of publication or collection of articles. And that is like a role that we play, is we try to read all of the EAPs that come through the process and look for ways of improving the clarity, removing superfluous information or embellishments on the EAP so that it's as clear and as readable to a global audience. And one thing that is to note about like these grammar things is that we tend to try and enforce that when people are writing EAPs, that they avoid using analogies that are culturally significant. And so it should be in like the most plain English, something that, people who English is their second or third language, they can still read these things and not have to understand the analogy that may be like mostly American or mostly British or something. So that's an important role for us. We give feedback on the content and to improve the clarity, like I said. And so that's kind of like a secondary task beyond making sure that all of the requirements are met. Giving feedback is an important. We tend, as like people who are reading all the EAPs, to also give feedback on the technical merit or the usefulness of the EAP. This isn't necessarily something that I feel falls directly, in line with the responsibility of what editors should do. But it tends to be that as we're just actively, we're actively a part of the Ethereum development community, whether it's being involved with core development, being involved with application development. And so it just makes a lot of sense for us to also give feedback on whether or not something makes sense as a standard itself. But generally, like what does fall under responsibilities is making sure that whatever the standard that's being proposed, it's clear to a wide audience what is being proposed. Another important responsibility is just educating authors on the EIP process. Yes, a lot of these things are documented. Yes, there are videos by Pooja. Yes, there are videos by me about how the EIP process works. Yes, there's lots of meetings, but at the end of the day, when people want to make standards and contribute to the EIP process, they may not seek out all these resources. And so we still, as EIP editors, need to make sure that the authors are educated, and we need to let them know, you're taking your draft from draft to final or draft to last call. You can't do that. You have to go through the process just like everybody else. And so the process is in EIP 1. So this is a common responsibility that we have when editing. Another, kind of tangentially related responsibility that doesn't really have to do with actually editing EIPs is just making sure that the EIP infrastructure is maintained. And when I say EIP infrastructure, I mean everything from like eips.ethereum.org, which is kind of the front-facing interface for all EAPs, and then the continuous integration suite that we have running in the repository that's running all of the syntactic checks that the EIPs are correctly formed and that there's no spelling errors. There's a reasonable amount of software engineering that's going into making all of this stuff run. And as the custodians of the EAPs repository, it tends to fall on the editors as making sure that stuff is maintained. We've been fortunate that the Ethereum cat herders have done an amazing job helping with that infrastructure. And we've had external developers working on improving the infrastructure over the last year. So that's been amazing. But like at the end of the day, the ultimate custodian of the repository is the editors. And so if for some reason these people were to disappear, the editors will have to step in and make sure that this stuff continues working, that it's still accessible through the eeps.ethereum.org portal. And lately, it feels like we do a lot of interpreting EIP rules and working to improve them. So again, the cat herders have been hosting this bi-weekly, now I think monthly call, the EIP call to improve the EIP process. And as editors, as very active participants in the EIP process, it's important that we are engaged in those discussions and helping to interpret what some things mean and working to improve it based on like our experience. It's difficult to try and improve these things if the people who are actively interpreting them on a day-to-day basis as they edit EAPs and are actively involved in the process are not helping improve it. It's difficult to get the buy-in without that. So I think that's an important responsibility as an editor as well. So I'll talk a little bit about the way that I edit, and it changes depending on what stage the EIP is in. And it also depends on what the type of EIP is, but I'll talk about that after this. So whenever an EIP comes in for its very first review, this means that it's the initial PR, it's trying to become a draft. Then what I'll do is I'll do a pretty thorough review. I'll make sure that the formatting is correct. I'll allow the bots to help me make sure that a lot of the formatting is correct. And then I'll provide editing suggestions. And those editing suggestions typically are not things that are blocking that EIP from being merged into draft. They're more things that, I think it would be clear if you wrote it this way, or you put some motivation in the specification section, that should be moved to the motivation. And those are things that I would say during that period. And then I would typically say, other than that, it looks good, but before you try and move it to the next stage, be sure to resolve these kinds of issues. So after they get their EIP merged into draft, they sort of have control over merging whatever kind of PRs that they want to. The editors don't have to review every single edit that comes in. So we, as an editor, only see the EIP again whenever they try and move the EIP from the draft stage to the review stage. And so at that point, we again need to review some of the formatting. The continuous integration system does verify that things like the preamble, the EIP's header is formatted correctly, but we need to go in and make sure that all the sections are still correct. They're not using a bunch of external links and pictures. And we need to make sure that some of the suggestions that we gave originally in the draft stage are, have been addressed. And then maybe I'll give some more editing suggestions, things that they should probably consider fixing, but maybe it's like less important than it was the feedback that I gave in the draft stage. And so they should like consider fixing that before they move it to last call. So whenever they're going from review to last call, this is a little bit more of a high stakes type of move from stage to stage, because at this point, like once it's in last call, it kind of has a terminal date in which the EIP will no longer be in last call. And once that date is reached, then it's pretty straightforward moving it to final. And once the EIP is final, there's really no going back and changing anything. So we want to make sure that as we're moving into this stage, that everything is being addressed. So we'll do a brief review of formatting, make sure that's still all correct. We'll now start requiring that some of the suggestions that we are making for clarity are being implemented into the EIP, and that may become like some sort of blocker if it's something that we think is like really important, or something that is really not making sense of the EIP. That might be something that they really need to incorporate. And then we'll also try and look around a little bit and see if there are outstanding issues. We try to avoid as best we can finalizing EIPs that have outstanding concerns about them. And so at this stage, you would want to go check the discussions to link, maybe check some of the last couple PRs, maybe from draft to review or something, and make sure that there's not really parties of interested users who are concerned with how the EIP is progressing. And this is just important because if you're going to spend all this time editing and reviewing EIPs, and the authors are spending a lot of time like actually creating the EIP, you want to make sure that it's going to be something that's useful to everyone. And so at this stage, it's just good to try and make sure that, is everybody on board with how this type of thing is going? And if they're not on board, try and reach some sort of resolution. Sometimes it's not possible, and the authors may just say like, look, we don't agree, we're going to go ahead, and that's okay. But you want to spend a little bit of time and make sure that those things don't exist. So then whenever you've done your last call, you've put in when the review period for last call is supposed to end, and that period comes and goes. At this point, it should be a relatively straightforward PR. There really shouldn't be any changes to the EIP itself. It should just be changing the status from last call to final. And so at that point, as an editor, you would just make sure that there are no outstanding issues, or if there were, that the authors fully accept that that's not something that they're willing to resolve. And then you can just do one more final check to make sure that the EIP is conforming how we expect it to conform. And so at that point, you would go ahead and merge the EIP and it's final. And that's more or less the entire process, how I would approach every different EIP. Then, occasionally you'll have PRs for EIPs that are already finalized. And as a finalized EIP, we're not going to allow any types of changes that might modify the meaning of the EIP, but we will accept errata changes that fix, spelling mistakes, typos, things like this, as long as it doesn't affect the actual specification of the EIP in any way. Anybody who's already implemented it will have to change nothing. It's just, purely for better understanding the EIP. So that's how I would approach all of these different stages. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about how I approach different types of EIPs in a second, but then I just want to go through this checklist of roughly what I do whenever I see an EIP. And so this is kind of my mental checklist that I go through every time that I see an EIP. And this is sort of stage agnostic. And so I'm just going to say, a bunch of things that I think about whenever I'm reviewing. And so like in this case, like if the EIP is new, then I would make sure that it has an EIP number. And, when people are creating EIPs, if they're not very familiar with how we typically assign numbers, they usually come from the PR number. And so maybe that they just still have the placeholder EIP number. And so I'll make sure to go in and say, hey, your EIP number is assigned to this. So go ahead and update your EIP with that. I'll review the title and make sure that it's clear. I'll make sure that it doesn't have any kind of formatting in it. There's no hyperlinks that they're trying to put in. It clearly describes what their EIP is trying to convey or standardize. And then I'll make sure that their description summarizes what they're trying to do. I'll make sure that they have a description, because this is a newer field that's been implemented in the EIPs repository a few months ago. And so sometimes people are still using an old version of the EIPs repo that they've cloned locally a year ago. And so we have to make sure they have the description, and we want to make sure that they don't have formatting in the description, because that typically doesn't, hyperlinks don't show up there. I'll check the discussions to link, and we're starting to have a more strict requirement that the discussions to link goes to a Fellowship of Ethereum Magicians thread rather than to some sort of GitHub issue or some external link. So that's an important thing to check, something that people forget pretty frequently. I'll also make sure that the type and the category that they've decided to put their EIP in makes sense. Usually this is not an issue, but every once in a while they might be trying to shoehorn their EIP into some category, and that's probably, it would probably fit in something better. So we'll make sure that all of those things are clear. And then the thing that's probably the most time consuming, that I do the most for every single EIP that I talked about in the flow, is I make sure that all of the required EIP sections are listed in the EIP, that they're in order with how EIP 1 defines the order to be. And I'll make sure that there's no unknown EIP sections, because it's pretty common for people to not realize that, not only do they have to have the required EIP sections, they can't be creating other top level EIP sections. And by top level, I mean, in Markdown, you have 2 pound signs to denote like one of these top level EIP sections. So there should only be the sections that are defined in EIP 1. I think Annette is okay. Yeah, and then another pretty common editing mistake that I see is that the EIP formatting is incorrect. And so I think last year it was decided that EIPs would be referred to this format EIP hyphen the number. And I often see people putting EIP space the number, EIP no space the number. And so I'll go through and I'll just make sure that that's correct. And I'll let them know that that's something that they need to update. A very contentious point of the EIPs process lately has been external links in EIPs. I tend to try and have minimal external links, but I take the stance of not saying no to every single external link. I do tend to be a lot more lenient for ERC types of EIPs than I do for core EIPs. But generally, we're just looking for, are they linking to things externally? Are those things that make sense to link to? If they are, could we just put them as an asset in the EIPs repository? Those are, the considerations that I have for external links. Then, we'll look at the spec and we'll make sure that the spec is straightforward. You want to avoid embellishing the spec too much. You want to avoid writing motivation, rationale in spec. The spec should just very clearly define what the EIP wants to standardize. And then we have the other sections for explaining why that makes sense, or like why the standard is needed. And so the spec is the wrong place to do that. So usually just read through it, make sure that that's the case. Sometimes I'll try and pull up the EIP and I'll actually load the rendered version of it rather than reviewing the diff view. And this helps me just see, is there some sort of weird markdown issue that I didn't notice by reviewing the EAP itself? This happens a lot with tables where the table may look okay when you're reviewing it, but when you actually pull up the rendered version, they have done something, they have, some missing character that's causing the table to not render. So it's good to make sure that the EAP looks pretty decent on the actually rendered version.
Just
yes,
out
this
of
is the main.
curiosity, what do you use for that when you do load it up?
What do I use to render the EAP? Is that what he said? He kind of cut out a little bit.
Yeah, just render. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. So there's like on GitHub, there's a, I guess I could just show, why not? There's usually like a little 3-dot thing at the top right of the EAP. And so if you're looking at files changed, you can click this little 3 dots and click view file. And so that'll just pull up the rendered version of the EAP. And so then you can check to make sure, okay, yeah, this all looks how it should look,
Got it. Cool. Thanks.
Okay, so we talked about, that's the rough checklist that I go through. And I also want to take a moment just to talk about the difference between how we think about core EAPs and how we review ERCs. So core EAPs are EIPs that actually modify the Ethereum protocol. They're things that typically would need to go through the hard fork process, that would need to be brought before all core devs and need to be, accepted into an upgrade at some point. And then there's the ERC, which is the EAP type that typically defines some sort of smart contract interface. And I do a lot of ERC editing, and Micah, who is probably the other most active editor at the moment, has decided not to do any ERC editing. There's a lot of ERCs, and a lot of them don't necessarily need to be ERCs. And it just becomes like a really time-consuming process to review all of these things, so I understand. And so for that reason, I tend to be a lot more lenient on what I would accept as an ERC versus a core EAP. The core EAPs, there tend to be a little bit less of them. They're often like a little bit more well specified, and there's like really usually not a question of whether a core EAP makes sense as an EAP, because if you're changing the protocol, you basically have to have a core EAP. For an ERC, oftentimes it's, there's different motivations. Maybe it's a marketing thing. Maybe they think it makes sense, whatever. I don't have enough time to try and, suss out the actual reasoning behind every ERC. So I just try to treat them all as like with the best intentions, do what I can to do to review. But typically when I'm reviewing them, I'm a lot more lenient on the actual structure, as long as it's like syntactically correct per EIP 1. I tend to just let it go through. And if they want to keep pursuing it to final, that tends to be, where I just let them go through. I don't want to be a gatekeeper and keep people who think that they have important ERCs that they want to push through. That said, there have been like a handful of ERCs that I've basically had to close, because after reviewing a handful of times and trying to get it to a place where I felt that it was like at the acceptable level of understandability, we weren't necessarily able to get it to that point. And so they did end up getting closed. But generally, if you follow the process, the ERCs will just go to final. And I mean, I guess like the same as for the core EIP, it's just that it's a lot more rigorous. We're really trying to make sure that these are very clear, that they're very well specified. And the ERCs, it's, I don't review a lot of the solidity on the ERCs because I'm not really a solidity developer. I'm just trying to make sure that it's, something at the high level I can understand roughly what's going on. And, hopefully as the author, they're making sure that because, they want people to use the standard, that the actual interfaces are all correct and everything.
Usually just interface.
Yeah.
Wait, sorry, my mic.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of how I view the two. I think as we scale up more editors, we can be a little bit more rigorous with ERCs. And I think, William's done a really great job of helping edit some of these ERCs. And I can already see that we're able to try to give more feedback now that it's sort of the responsibility is dispersed a little bit. But that's sort of the current state of affairs regarding those two. Okay. Let's talk about our virtual EIP helpers. We have a couple bots that help us. We have this EIP-V. This is a validating bot that I wrote, I guess, about 2 years ago. And mostly what this bot does is it reads this like preamble at the beginning of the EIP, and it makes sure that syntactically these things are correct. Like there's the correct number of spaces, all of the correct sections are there. The sections that have like enum values, that it's one of the expected values, it's not some random made up one. You know, just these kinds of like really simple validation checks. It doesn't really understand the semantics of the EAPS repository. Like if you move from draft to final, it wouldn't sort of catch any of that stuff. The EAP bot has a lot more semantic information. And so the EAP bot is like the actual auto merge bot. And so if EAP-V passes, then the EAP bot will also review the EAP, and it will do more of these semantic checks. Like, has an EIP editor reviewed this? If it's something that multiple EIP editors have reviewed, have they reviewed it? Are they going from draft to review? If so, it must be reviewed. If it's just a draft update, then they'll go ahead and merge it if the person who's opening the PR is an author on EAP. So it has a lot more contextual information about what is a valid merge and what is not a valid merge. And so maybe eventually we can just combine these two, the functionality of these two is just, you know, like most things, it's just a time consuming process of taking the rules that are written in this Rust EAP-V bot and porting them into this TypeScript bot. But, you know, one day we can have all those things. So if we look at a PR, a pull request that, you know, has the bots running, then you'll see that you have these sort of 4 actions that are basically going on. And so the main 2 that we care about is this. This is the EAP bot, this auto merge bot, and then we have the Travis CI. So the Travis CI is running the EAP validator, and then the auto merge is the GitHub action running EAP bot. And so if, you know, we have to have all of these passing for an EAP to be accepted, this EAP bot will always have a red X, even if it's passed all of the semantic checks that it's doing, until an editor comes and reviews it, if it's like waiting for an editor request. So the main things that you're usually looking for is making sure that Travis CI is passing. And if Travis CI has an X here, you can just click details and pull up the Travis CI page and sort of get an idea. There'll be some logs from running the validation on the EAP, and you can usually see like, okay, this EAP is invalid because it's missing a title on it or something like that. And then, or it has a spelling error. So the spelling errors, the validation errors, those would all come through on Travis. And then the merge bot is doing a lot of those semantic checks. So once, you know, all of those go green, then the EAP bot will just go ahead and merge that EAP into the repository. And that kind of looks like that. So, you know, previously maybe this EAP is like ready to go. It's just waiting for an editor to review. I review something like that, and I just approve it. And then the EAP bot can go in and auto merge it after I've approved. So that's basically how the EAP bots work. And hopefully I was able to kind of explain some of the different things that the EAP bots are able to check for us. The things that the bots like can't check for us yet that you know, in the future would be great is checking that all of the sections that are there in the markdown, and that, you know, there are no unknown sections. I think that would be a really helpful feature, because that's something that as an editor, I end up spending a fair amount of time looking for. And if that was automated, then I could just focus more on actually making sure the EAP is clear. Okay. So that's roughly like the process that I go through whenever I'm editing. I want to just take a quick second and talk about how you could get started editing. There is this apprenticeship program, editor program that the cat herders have been running for the last few months. And we try and do it, I think, 2 times a month, every 2 weeks or so. And this is a great place where we just kind of sit down and I'll share my screen and we'll just talk about editing EAPs, and we'll just edit them together. And this is just a good way to get a feel of like, what am I looking for? What kinds of changes are usually required? And it's just a good way to just start getting involved in that process. You know, let me just tell you like how did I got involved in this process. Step 1, I read EIP 1 and I tried to commit it to memory. EIP 1 is the like ultimate guide of how to edit EIPs. It tells you everything that you need to know about what a valid EIP isn't, and what you know, what you need to do to be able to move from stage to stage of the process. And a lot of authors are not reading this, or at least they're not reading in depth. So if you just go through and read this and understand this, you now have a lot of information that you can share on EAPs to help the authors and to help the editors avoid having to say the exact same things. So that was the first thing. I was like, I'm kind of interested in EIP editing. I'll just go read EIP 1 and then, maybe I'll start commenting on things. So this is like, I think maybe one of the first reviews that I left for someone. And, I just try and be like very, very kind to the person, because I'm not an editor. I'm just some random person on the internet who's leaving comments. But, because I read EIP 1, I have some ideas that may help you get your EIP merged faster. So maybe you should consider like this review that I've given. And honestly, most of the time, the authors don't even know who the editors are. So if you're just going in there, reviewing them, being polite and giving good feedback, they're just like, that's an editor. And I think that's what happened to me. People thought I was an editor for a while before I actually was ever, truly considered an editor. And so then, just do this for a little, just for a few months, just keep going in and like keep giving feedback, try to, be part of the process and help people understand the process better who are not as involved in the community. And yeah, another one, just, this looks good to me. And at this time, like I don't have any kind of, weight in saying whether something can be approved or not, but I can just say that, it looks good to me. And then an editor can come in and say, you know what, this light client guy, he's been reviewing EIPs for a little bit. He said it looks good. I don't even have to spend as much time on it now because they, I trust that, they have reviewed it and that it looks, it follows the, it does follow the EIP 1 requirements as expected. And so it's really about just building that trust, between the editors and between the authors, and that's just something that you have to do over and over again. It's not something that you review one EIP and now you're like a trusted editor or something. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have for this presentation. I think there's some questions that we probably want to chat about, but yeah, I think becoming an EIP editor is definitely not an impossible task by any means, and it's something that we could really use. So if you're interested, please check out the EIP apprenticeship, the EIP editor apprenticeship, and just contribute to reviewing EIPs. There's really nothing, no kind of blockers. It's fully permissionless. Just hop in.
Awesome. Cool. It was really a nice presentation. And the depth that you tried to cover with this presentation, I'm sure it's going to help a lot of new contributors. I see quite a few people joining the call today. So let me first open the floor for any question if they have.
Hello, man. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Hi. I have a question regarding, so I think I and William exchanged some conversation on one of the EIP that was recently created. That was regarding an NFT that is to be attached to a smart asset like an IoT device. Now, I have a background in IoT for the past 4 or 5 years, and a lot of the technical specifications mentioned in that is not very, how should I put it, not very sound when I try to read it, because there are a lot of missing details, or there's a lot of just jargon being thrown inside the EIP. So regarding that, how do you tackle, or how should I put it? How do you talk to the author and try to make them understand that it has to come to a technical specification and these are the things that are missing? Is there a quick hack or a good empathetic way to convey convey it to them? How do you go about it?
Yeah, so I mean, this is kind of what I was trying to allude to, is like, whenever we're talking about these ERCs, separating the difference between making sure that the EAP follows the EIP process, that it's syntactically correct, everything that needs to be there is there. And then there's, the actual technical discussion about the EAP. And, you're coming from this place where you really understand that space and you're reading the EIP and you're like, as an expert in this space, this is not making sense to me. And so it's, there's like this difficulty there because generally we don't have enough time to go through and actually do very thorough review with that background, because you may understand the IoT space really well, but then someone will come in with like some metaverse thing that's fully different. And so as having a limited number of editors, it's very difficult to give the same kind of technical review. And so if it comes across that there is this EIP that you have good technical insight in, then I think that it's like, very welcome for you to try and say like, look, hey, this is something that I know because, I've done it in these places, or, for whatever reason that you understand this topic, then you can go into the discussions to link. That's where I think like most of the technical discussion should happen, not necessarily in the PR, because the PRs are more ephemeral. And so I would hop into the discussions too and say, hey, like, here are my concerns about this EIP. If you're an editor, yeah, I'm an editor, and we're going to let you like continue to pursue this EIP because, we're not really trying to be some sort of gatekeeper, but, these are like really, concerns that I have. And that's typically, they'll typically respond. Like if it's an author who like really does care about their EIP, if they're having like actual people, especially people who understand what they're talking about, coming in and saying there's issues, there's usually going to be some sort of good dialogue there. So I think that's how I would approach it. It's just like, if you have time, if you have the experience, share that information with them, give them all the tools they can acquire to improve their EIP. But at the end of the day, if they're just going to push it through, we're usually not going to just stop them.
Okay, makes sense. So I think I'm just having trouble separating my technical review brain and the English part of, let's say, the proofreading part of the brain, the editor part of the brain. Maybe that's the issue. I think I need to figure that out. Makes sense.
And I guess the line's kind of blurry. And I mean, here you have a concern that does affect the way that they would write the EIP, but I think it gets to a certain level of foundation, it needs to go into the discussions. It's more about the how than the technical way they wrote it.
Yeah.
I see that EIP editing is like one of the most responsible contribution to the Ethereum blockchain. You also have mentioned a lot of responsibilities of being an EIP editor, because we cannot see anything less than just the best for the community. So first of all, I would like to thank you and the rest of the EIP editors for your work. And the presentation has already covered some of the key queries, but I still have a few questions for you. And the first question is about the consensus layer EIP process and for future upgrades that we can see after the merge. I have seen your engagement with execution client and the EIP process, which seems to be working so far for the network upgrade pretty well. You did talk about the core EIPs that we are using for network upgrade. But that's not the case for the beacon chain. The Altair upgrade did not engage in the EIP process, which is similar to the POW chain. So I would be interested to learn about how do you imagine the EIP process for the consensus layer chain? Do you imagine it to be similar or different from the execution layer after the merge?
I do expect that it's going to be, relatively similar to how changes happen on the execution layer. But I think that these two things are going to be pretty separated even after the merge, just because there's a lot of technical experience that goes into both of them. And I think that there's just different sets of engineers and researchers working on the two things. And so it doesn't really make sense because a lot of times there's not as much overlap. Like the consensus engines are these black boxes more or less, and then the execution clients are these black box functions more or less. And so changes to either of those typically are not interacting with, each other. And so I think that my understanding is that we're going to continue with the execution layer calls, these all core dev calls, and then we're going to continue with these consensus layer calls. And I don't know which one will be, if there happens to be something that needs to be discussed amongst all the groups, if there'll be a new call for that, or if that will just continue being part of like the all core devs as it, generally has been. But I think like, concretely to answer, I think that there's going to be more formalization around consensus layer changes. Will they create EIPs? I think that they probably will have to start creating EIPs for changes to the consensus layer after the merge. Maybe they'll continue their process that they have, just with like more formal requirements of those things. But yeah, I think mostly separate, just increasing the rigor in which the consensus layer changes get reviewed.
Yeah, that's interesting because I have seen a few networking layer EIPs which are there for consensus layer, just that couldn't see them following the same process. So it would be nice to see something new that is coming up. My next question is again about the EIP process, which we can see after the merge. So you have so much experience with EIP documenting and editing, and you have been involved in the development side as well. You are an active proposer and champion for improvement proposals. It would be interesting to hear your vision of EIP process after the merge. And if you could also talk about a little bit on the Sam Wilson's proposal that we had a few meetings ago, please share some thoughts about the new EIP process.
Yeah. So I think that I haven't been really involved in ETH2, now called the consensus layer. There were periods of time where I was more involved, and periods of time I've been less involved. But I think that, just being a bit of an outside observer to that process, I've been really impressed with how they've been able to be spec driven. So almost from the beginning, they had this markdown spec that defined what the beacon chain is going to look like. And over time, they've done a lot of work to actually make it become an executable spec where they can generate tests from it and run it against other clients. And I've just been able to sort of see, from this like third party perspective, them proposing changes using the spec and then being able to discuss the changes with like very high degree of detail because they're talking about diffs over code rather than pros in an EIP. And I think that like really clicked for like myself and Sam and other people in the community earlier this year. And we were talking, it'd be really cool if we had this canonical place for the execution layer as well to describe all of the the entire consensus, the state transition function that exists in the execution clients. And so I think that, this probably isn't going to happen with the merge per se, but I think like going forward, that's something that's like very much a focus for the execution layer, is to try and become spec driven like they are for the consensus layer. And so I think that if we both become spec driven, that's going to allow us just to have more similar processes across each other, because there is these different scenarios right now where they're very like PR driven because a PR is actually a change to the specification of their protocol. And right now we don't necessarily have that. We're still very EIP driven. I don't think that means that EIPs go away by any means. I think EIPs are here to stay. And I think there's a lot of important auxiliary information that are getting coded into EIPs that you can't and shouldn't encode into code, like the motivation of why a change should be made, the rationale, things to consider about the security implications. Those are all things that we still need to document. And so I think those will continue to be documented in the EIP. It's just that now we'll be able to, rather than defining the specification in prose or really broken, implementations that live in the EIP, we can have this like living piece of this living project that actually executes the EVM, executes the state transition function. So I think, going forward in the future, that the execution layers are going to become more spec driven, and that's just going to help unify the whole process of making changes to both layers.
Interesting. And maybe if I could follow. So the last couple of questions were kind of the future of core EIPs, either spec driven or that kind of thing. But in terms of also just looking at GitHub as a coordination mechanism, which I think is also kind of an integral part of the whole EIP process now. Like we're this many years in, and I kind of wonder if anybody else has tried using GitHub as this much of a coordination mechanism as Ethereum is through the EIPs right now. Do you think that's always going to be the future of EIPs? Just like, EIP numbering by PR and GitHub, like, GitHub is now kind of in terms of bringing standards to Ethereum?
I think it's going to be more challenging whenever we have to create EIP numbers for consensus layer changes. And it's not really clear exactly what that process is going to be. I think it's not scalable to forever use PR numbers from GitHub, but there's just no plans to change that at this point. I think until there's a reason to change it, we'll keep it as is. I will say that I would be in favor of doing something where we stop burning so many numbers, because as we get more EIPs, as there's more authors, more changes to EIPs, that number is just going to keep growing.
Right.
And
I have some kind of algorithm in my mind that for like each 100 EIPs that get added in, there's a disproportionate number of other PRs that are not new EIPs that happen in the repo, just because of the surface of different things that they could be happening on as time increases. So there should be less and less key, like so to speak, EIPs per 100 numbers or whatever as time goes by.
Yeah, and I have a follow-up on the process part that we are discussing for the future standardization process. what do you think will be required to push this new proposed process as a standard? Because I understand devs currently are really engaged with the merge is the priority, but at the same time, there should be some efforts which may be required on educating authors and other users that something is changing, and for that agreement is also required, so we can get the consensus on that part, like whether or not people are liking this proposal. What do you think would be the right approach to follow the new process?
The new process with the
PR
executable
based.
spec.
Yeah.
Oh, the PR based, yeah. I think that like what we'll likely see is that people will create PRs that change the code of the spec, and then they'll link to some PR or some EIP that actually encode all the other information. That's kind of like the minimal, the least intrusive way of providing that new PR based flow. I think that if we were to really change the situation up a little bit more, it might be better to have it be fully PR based and have, some way of having a single PR introduce the change and introduce the EIP. It's not exactly clear about how to make all these things happen. There's a lot of breaking changes that could happen if we do it in these different ways. The first way that I said, where you just do each of them separately, has the least minimal breaking changes of all. So that's probably where the Schelling point will land on. But I think we're still exploring exactly how to make that happen.
Well, it will be interesting, and I really look forward to having this new proposal shared with the community soon. All right. So my next question is about the ERC process. I saw in one of your presentation, you did talk about core versus the ERC. ERC is, like, on a high level, is a debatable topic. We have heard different opinions on editing and management of the improvement proposals of this particular category. And yeah, we did talk about, like, there were suggestions to move this proposal out of the present GitHub repository and have a separate process defined. So as an editor, you have reviewed multiple ERCs and EIPs. Obviously, ERCs is also a standard track EIP. It would be nice to hear your take, why or why not you think ERCs should be in the current EIP repository.
I think that, I'm kind of a fan of splitting the ERCs out to their own repository, or, at minimum, creating a different flows for the two, because I think that they're just very different in what they're actually providing, who needs to review them, what the considerations are. And it, to me, just is a lot of noise to have all of that happening in one single repository. There was kind of, for a while, we were waiting to just pull the ERCs out completely. And like the problem with how to do the EIP flow after we have an executable spec, there's just lots of breaking changes that can occur. If we decide to remove all the ERCs from the GitHub repository, now you're breaking tons of links that have existed for, who knows how long, that link to the GitHub repository rather than the eeps.ethereum.org. So it's kind of a mess to really do some serious change to how the structure is laid out. So I think, like, right now we're in this holding pattern where we're waiting to see what happens with the executable spec and whether people, how people want to interact with the executable spec. If we go with this process, like I just explained before, where people are creating EEPs in the EEPs repository and they're creating PRs in the executable specs repository, it may be that we still want to remove ERCs because the the EIP repository will continue to be just used for core EEPs mainly. It's also possible that we do this like PR only core EEP flow, where then maybe we'll just give the EEPs repository the ERCs and they can just continue having full reign, and then we'll have the EEPs in the executable specs. So I think that's kind of why there hasn't been a big push to make a lot of changes there, but it's clear that the people involved in the process are not happy with exactly how it is right now, and that we think that there are better ways of doing it.
Do you think the number of proposals that are coming from a application standard side is responsible for this thought to move the ERC out of the EIP repository? Because I understand the networking and interface EIPs, these are also standard track EIPs, and they also do not follow the core EIP process like getting into network upgrade and all, but they are low in number.
Yeah, I think because they're so low in number that we just don't give them a lot of weight in the discussions, and we're like really heavily weighted by core EAPs and ERCs. And so, yeah, there's things like networking interface and meta that will, it's really not clear what exactly is going to happen. But unfortunately, we're starting to move in this direction where the networking EAPs are going to be standardized by this dev P2P GitHub repository, and then the interface EAPs are generally being standardized in this execution APIs repository. So we're slowly starting to like break apart this really complicated standardization, organization, and, put them into their little niche subcategories. The problem is that sometimes there are networking EAPs that don't necessarily fall under a dev P2P protocol change, or sometimes there's an interface EAP that doesn't necessarily fall under, it doesn't necessarily fall
Interface.
under the interface. So, I think that we might have to broaden the scope of what an ERC is beyond, just being an interface for smart contracts, and maybe it's just a more generic application level standard. That's something that I think that's like pretty reasonable. But yeah, we just generally don't think about them.
Well, that's quite acceptable, because we have very few EIP editors, and the proposals those are coming up are really big in number. So whatever works for everyone is fair now. My last question is about the EIP editors apprenticeship program that the caterers are running. We have been running this program for over 2 months, so I think more than that, and we have received good traction recently. Now we can see some comments coming from different contributors, which is absolutely great. I was wondering if you have any suggestions on how we can identify when and who could be promoted from the apprentice editor to the EIP editor.
I'm going to give the micro response of, as we start to encode the exact, criteria that makes someone move from one stage to another, then you like create this baseline. It's very easy for people to say, I'm going to just do those exact things. And then once I've done them, like I've met that requirement, so I should become an editor. And so I think that it's better to just have more informal process where we sort of feel like, this person has been contributing for like X number of months. And I do think it is on the time scale of like at least, months of contributions rather than, a couple of weeks of contributions. So, we generally feel that person is contributing for, this period of time, and their contributions are, tend to be good. I think this is just like an informal conversation that the editors need to have, and that the EIP meeting can also provoke, is that, this person has been doing this. Like, what do you think? Like, what would you like to see? And so you just kind of like let it naturally evolve beyond that. If you're an apprentice right now, or you want to become an apprentice and you're like, what do I need to do to, move to that next level? I think that if you're just, coming and reviewing, as many EAPs as you can over a multi-month period, then it's pretty likely that you're going to be asked to become an editor. If you feel like you have been contributing for a while and you're still not an editor, but you feel like you're giving good contributions, and there's really you're not creating reviews that are getting conflicted with other editors where they're saying, this person said this, but like, that's actually not right. As you become better and better, like, just ask, hey, I've been contributing for this many months. What do you think? Is it time for me to become an editor? Or like, what's the current feeling? And I think that that's, is this going to scale to 1,000 editors? Probably not. But I think that it will scale to another dozen editors.
That would be super helpful. Thank you. Yeah, well, we are about to hit time, but if anyone else has any further question for Matt?
And I guess maybe if I could just try, like looking at the EIP process as you look at it now, what do you think the EIP process does well? And what do you think are kind of like the biggest pain points in the process as it exists right now?
I feel like the EIP process does do a pretty good job about creating a single point of contact for ideas that people are trying to propose. And I think that the EIP process does do a pretty good job about, distilling those ideas into formats that are pretty shareable and pretty readable. I think the biggest pain points for the EIP process are, number one, I think there's the lack of editors, the fact that EIPs can sit there for weeks on end. I've probably got 50 notifications right now on the EIPs repository that I need to get into. And I'm going to get into it probably, this weekend, because it's been a lot of other things to do this week. And so that's just like not a great UX for the authors who are trying to make their EIPs happen. So I think that that's like a pretty big pain point. I think another pain point is that, we're giving people EIP numbers and we're creating this point where they can coordinate against even without becoming final. And that just allows them to create a draft with an EIP number and then say, this is an EIP. Like I saw Gnosis Safe, they're using the, the new format for defining like multi-network addresses. And I don't know if that's final.
Yeah.
Is that final?
Ooh, I don't remember, but I don't think so.
So it's like, they're like, yeah, we implemented CEIP, but if that EIP is in review status, it could change. And so, fortunately, that's like an application type of thing and not like a smart contract. They could update to continue supporting it, but people do this in smart contracts too, where they're like, this is the NFT standard, and the NFT standard changes, and then they don't support the NFT standard anymore. So I think that's a pretty big pain point. Yeah, I feel like those are the main things that come to the top of my head.
Cool.
All right. I must say that Matt and other EIP editors are doing a wonderful job. Sometimes it is criticized, but I suppose that's the perk of being an editor. Having said that, thanks once again, Matt, to share the presentation and talk about the EIP editing. I'm positive that it will help many new contributors. On this note, a huge thank you to our YouTube viewers for watching PEEPanEIP, and a shout out to one of the YouTube viewers, Joel Alexander, for encouraging comments. We find the ECH YouTube to be the most information-rich YouTube channel. Thank you for your comments, and we'll look forward to sharing more informative episodes of PEEPanEIP and other resources, the research work which is being done by the Ethereum developers. So people, if you haven't subscribed to the Ethereum Cat Herders YouTube channel already, please hit the subscribe button now. Check out the description section for guest detailed and related resources for EIP and editing. We'll be back with another interesting topic for you. Till then, keep watching, keep sharing your love with Ethereum Cat Herders. See you soon.